Good evening, and welcome to tonight's event for Urbanism Beyond Corona. I'm Keith Crumwoody, Dean of the Architecture Division at California College of the Arts. At CCA, it's customary to acknowledge the land on which we learn and work. CCA campuses are located in Huichin and Yelamu, also known as Oakland and San Francisco, respectively, on the unceded territories of the Chochenyo and Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, who have continuously lived upon this land since time immemorial. We recognize the historic discrimination and violence inflicted upon Indigenous peoples in California and the Americas, including their forced removal from ancestral lands and the deliberate and systematic destruction of their communities and culture. CCA honors Indigenous peoples, past, present, and future, here and around the world, and we wish to pay our respect to local elders, including those on the lands from which you are joining us virtually today. It's my pleasure tonight to welcome Giovanna Borasi, director of what we refer to here as the Other CCA, the Canadian Centre for Architecture, who will interpret the findings of the Urbanism Beyond Corona Instagram series, which was curated by the Urban Works Agency and History Theory X, two of the 4 research and teaching labs in the Architecture Division at CCA. This event, presented in partnership with the Asian Art Museum as part of the After Hope Videos of Resistance exhibition, is part of the Fall 2020 CCA Architecture Lecture Series titled Remaking, through which we are bringing important contemporary thinkers and makers to CCA to reflect upon the work we need to do now to co-imagine a just and equitable future. Our next and final event of the Fall Series will be a lecture next Monday night at 6 p.m. Pacific Time by Sean Canty, an alumnus of our BARC program, an assistant professor at the GSD, and the principal of Studio SC. You can learn more about our programs, including the next event, by visiting scaffold.architecture.cca.edu. Again, thanks for joining us tonight. I'll now turn things over to Padma Maitland, who will share some more information about After Hope.
Great evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Padma Maitland. I'm assistant professor at Cal Poly and one of the co-curators and organizers of the After Hope program at the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco. I'm delighted and honored to be here with everyone for tonight's keynote lecture. Thank you to all the organizers and everyone who made it possible and for the opportunity to be a part of it. Marking the inauguration of the Asian Art Museum's Trilogy series, After Hope brings together artists, activists, and community leaders for an interdisciplinary and critical examination of hope's potential to animate form, method, and action. The prompt to think after addresses the complex ways hope affects our vision for the future and judgment of the past, asking both what it means to go after hope and what comes after hope. Partnerships with other institutions are a key aspect of the project, expanding the conversation and offering new perspectives on art and cultural production as inseparable from daily life, politics, and policies. Building on Jeanette Kim's insightful comments from this morning session, which was really stellar, I found myself wondering if moving beyond is the same as being after. And so with that, I'll hand it back to the organizers. Thank you again for the chance to be here.
Great. Thank you, Padma. I'm Niraj Bhatia. I'm an associate professor at CCA and founder of the design practice, The Open Workshop. Thank you all for joining us tonight for the wrap-up and keynote lecture to Urbanism Beyond Corona. Tonight's program was conceived by 2 research labs at CCA, the Urban Works Agency and Experimental History Project, and supported in part by the After Hope exhibition at the Asian Art Museum. Thank you to Padma for proposing this co-sponsored event of very 2 mission-aligned programs. Today, I'll be introducing the series on behalf of the Urban Works Agency, which is directed by Jeanette Kim, Antje Steinmuller, Christopher Roach, and myself, as well as the Experimental History Project, directed by Irene Chang. Thank you to Keith and the CCA Architecture Division for their support of tonight's project, as well as Sarah, who is coordinating everything behind the scenes. And finally, a big thank you to Jeanette Kim, who spearheaded this very critical conversation. So imagining life after the COVID-19 pandemic alternately conjures up bleak forecasts and hopeful speculations. Despite ongoing conversations about a new normal, it seems that there has never been nor never will be anything normal. The pandemic shines light on a crisis that has been years in the making through systemic distributions of power and wealth. How can we look ahead with more calibrated optimism? Doing so might require that we open up urban narratives to deeper structural analysis and infrastructural practices to more radical reimagination. Doing so might also explore how interim steps of coping and recovery can prompt far more ambitious future states, and avoid reverting to a pre-corona status quo. This is the power of our current moment of suspension, to reconsider the precarity and inequity within the systems that govern our lives. COVID-19 is distinctly spatial in its redistribution of bodies, collective forums, and territorial systems. Neoliberal playbooks have triggered government bankruptcy even as they are blocked by rent strikes and shuttered storefronts. Cities have designated maintenance and care as essential, mobilizing workers negotiating power while perpetuating their exposure. Shelter-in-place orders have recuperated a therapeutic role for the home while unmasking its other meanings as a site of abuse, labor, and social infrastructure. The pandemic distances and it recombines. It has exaggerated inequalities among segregated communities. It has furthered entrenched populist culture wars and anti-immigrant backlash. It has even brought the open floor plan into question. But the pandemic has also transformed public parks into hospital waiting rooms, schools of architecture into factories, and boutique organic farms into food banks. Conditions of density and urban form are crystallized by Euclidean codes for a hygienic city, are today recharged by questions of governance and power essential to shaping a more equitable city. Political boundaries seem as arbitrary and capricious as ever. Never has the feeling that we are one planet been more tangible and urgent. So Urbanism Beyond Corona was set up as a series of Instagram posts that were published every Wednesday in June by different architects, urbanists, and scholars of the built environment. Each of our 118 fantastic contributors listed here was asked to offer a prediction, warning, gift, hack, instrument, prompt, or question that reflects on the role designers and urban actors can play in shaping cities after COVID-19. We created this series in hopes of sparking an open, informal conversation amidst this ever-changing situation. We welcome provisional ideas on particular topic and hope readers and authors alike will feel free to retune and adjust as the pandemic develops. A big thank you to all of our contributors. It has been really inspiring to see all the great work everyone in this group is doing. Earlier today, we unpacked the topics from these posts into more intimate roundtable conversations centered on the sub-themes of solidarity, power, iterative urbanism, public space and collectivity, justice, resources and territories, biopolitics, and risk and normalization. And a big shout out here to Jeanette Kim, who I always knew was an amazing designer, but I was never quite prepared for how beautiful her Excel files would be. So thank you, Jeanette. This is a screen capture from this amazing group we had this morning, and what an amazing way to start the morning and the week. These really amazing and rich discussions left me optimistic about the conversations we're having in the discipline. Thank you to everyone that joined and for sharing your thoughts. So tonight I have the extreme honor of welcoming our keynote speaker, Giovanna Borasi, to the California College of the Arts. Architect, editor, and curator Giovanna Borasi joined the Canadian Center for Architecture in 2005, first as the curator of contemporary architecture and then as chief curator from 2014 to 2019. She has been director of the CCA since January 2020. Borasi's work explores alternative ways of practicing and evaluating architecture, considering the impact of contemporary environmental, political, and social issues on urbanism and the built environment. She studied architecture at the Politecnico School in Milan, worked as an editor of Lotus International, Lotus Navigator, and was deputy editor-in-chief at Abitare magazine. Borasi's latest curatorial project is a three-part documentary film series that considers the changing definition of home and homelessness as a result of urban and economic pressures. The first iteration, What It Takes to Make a Home, premiered last year in New York and will continue circulating at film festivals worldwide. In February, it was screened at the 58th Commission for the Social Development at the United Nations headquarters. For this event, we've asked Giovanna to offer her reflections on the tendencies, debates, and strategies she sees emerging from the series, especially in light of the way the pandemic has evolved since the series took place in June. We look to her as an interpreter. Earlier this year, Giovanna penned an open letter entitled "Listening is Not Enough," reflecting on institutions and power and aligning with ideas put forth in an earlier publication, "The Museum is Not Enough." She writes, quote, Architecture has always been an expression of power, but the last decades are also revealing the growing power of community action and bottom-up initiatives, particularly with regard to environmental issues. Our curatorial work and our public programs have been increasingly driven by the study of these power relationships and how the built environment contributes to social transformation. Today, we commit to expanding these platforms so that they multiply points of view and perspectives on inequality, better deconstruct the apparent normality of the world around us, and more broadly disseminate opportunities presented by moments of change. I present to you Giovanna Borasi.
Hi, good evening. Thanks a lot, Neeraj, and thanks to all of you for being here and welcoming to the CCA. Also for us here in Montreal at the Canadian Centre for Architecture, you are the other CCA. So I would like to thank especially Jeanette Kim, Neeraj, Antis Steinmuller, Chris Roach, and the Urban Work Agency, and Elaine Cheng at the Experimental History Project at California College and for the Arts, and also the Asian Art Museum for their support for this lecture. So I would like to congratulate all of you for the creation of the project and the hashtag Urbanism Beyond Corona, and for today's seminar. I followed it a bit, and I think it did already an amazing work to tackle so many issues related to what COVID has also brought us, and so I'm not sure what I will be able to add. But I want to say that I particularly like the way you framed the platform, Urbanism Beyond Corona, and what the call was about. The idea that all the people were called to offer a prediction, a warning, a gift, a hack, an instrument, a prompt, or a question that reflects on the role of design and urban actors in playing, shaping cities after COVID. I think the idea of these many formats has instigated different contribution, critical and speculative, provocative and constructive. So as Neeraj said, I was asked to review the many ideas that were proposed in response to the open call, and has been really fascinating to look over 188, I think, submitted proposal. It was a revealing exercise, and I followed the hashtag actually and the post while they were appearing over the months, but it's been interesting to see all again together, but also consider the long-term existence and how we actually relate differently to the post that were done in different time as the crisis evolves and complicates. So one, I had the privilege to have a panoramic overview of the today concern, but at the same time, the ideas that are occupying architects and other disciplines, artists and thinkers. But also I had the opportunity to reflect upon how these ideas, the separate ideas, especially zooming out from the specificity of each one, began to tell a larger story of the current status where we all like urbanism and architectural discourse to be during the pandemic and after. We have seen similar projects, many of these projects appearing during this year that try to understand the crisis, map the phenomenon connected, create design ideas for a post-COVID or a awful return to normality, or even ones who try to archive these ideas as a bank of concepts we will be able to return back, as we might tend to deny that all this happened or just want to forget. And this happens with crisis. When I worked on the crisis of 1973, the oil crisis, for example, that spurred architectural innovation by taking on an environmental agenda, paired with do-it-yourself mentality and looking at how new technique and technologies could be embedded into architecture itself and its processes. Architecture at that moment felt empowered to search for solution itself and potentially new ways of living. The 2008 financial crisis expanded the definition of what an architecture can be, and beyond just act of a building, extending its particular way of thinking into other mediums. However, taking the heat from these past global disruptions, Often these radical and speculative futures envisioned fade as the comfort of a familiar normality returns. Imagining new futures has always been far easier than realizing them. There is also the concern that the pandemic will be used cynically to advance certain agendas that will increase economic disparity or presumption, an idea of access. For example, digital access is actually not universal. I will get back to this point. So what I will try to do tonight is highlight what I think are the more interesting ideas, questions, and trends that have surfaced through this hashtag. I might explain that I use the word interesting, which can often convey a certain banality, but it's used in not fastidious way, rather than an attempt to not evaluate this proposal based on whether they are good or bad. Instead, qualify if they point to a larger question and ideas being asked by the discipline and society. So I understood my role, if I will simply have to if I would simplify and banalize it, as a user of the hashtag. I did not have to determine the validity of each approach or idea, but had to recognize emerging trends, direction, or potential question being posed. Overall, the proposal asked to reimagine the capacity of architecture and urbanism to undo and redo themselves within the intricacies of the worlds we are made. To preface, I had to extract and amplify the intention behind some of ideas in order to expose an underlying train of thoughts that might have not been immediately detectable. Finally, I should disclose that the ideas that I resonated with are those that touch upon part of my work or the CCA, my CCA, upcoming research and curatorial projects dealing with societal transformation and its impact and relationship with urban and architectural issues. So here you go, a series of hopefully purposed observations. The first one, a frightful alignment. One of the main issues reflected on in the different posts is that the health crisis is connected to COVID is in fact more than just a health crisis. It has revealed to many the deep interconnectedness of other crises. So what we're left with now, and globally we struggle with, are many crises at the same time, or many facets of the same crisis. The environmental one, the labor one, the racial one, the economical one, on top of the health one. I think we can all agree that the health crisis, if not the primary cause of these other different system failures, has been ultimately at least a way to viscerally expose the systemic injustice and inequities present in our society. It is a deadly and unfortunate alignment of all these what we are witnessing. The countries where economical, environmental, and social supports or regulated frameworks for the majority of their population were not in place have experienced a kind of disastrous domino effect, often most harming the same racialized and gender groups. So many of the ideas posted with the hashtag were observing, enlightening, and denouncing this. So while the government and health institutions are telling or urging, or in certain countries even forcing us to stay home, to breathe, to wash your hands, many contributions ask how we could do this while we struggle simply with access to clean air, to clean water. Breathing and washing your hands seems like a too simple action, but suddenly it is evident they are not accessible to all. The historical decision to dump, for example, in New York City into Queens, to dump New York City waste into Queens, generating one of the most polluted areas in the country, where asthma rates for children is among the highest in the country, is now showing all the shortcomings of this strategy and the undeniable consequences on the population put in danger without them being involved. Or the case of the Navajo Nation, where exploitation of their territories for mining operation has drained and contaminated all the remaining water resources. So environmental justice created a health issue that affected communities of color that become environmental racism. So I think the complexity of the current situation is this frightful alignment and overlap of all these different societal injustices. Someone told me that a bridge will definitely fall if 3 mistakes or mismanagements happen at the same time in the same place. I think that many metaphorical bridges have fallen in 2020. We could say the same thing for the home. Shelter at home strategy has been clearly showing the housing crisis we're facing in our cities. Homeless or migrant communities who are living in compact and dense neighborhoods, aging population who couldn't opt to isolate themselves in living in house care and expose their bodies to more risk. In Canada also and elsewhere, this revealed the delayed effects has had in the slow defunding of our healthcare system has caused, which worsened the spread of the virus among long-term care facilities. Many have commented on the divide between who can retreat safely and whose body is instead constantly exposed. This has created a new labor classification where the exposure to risk has moved from people working in construction site, for example, to a person operating a cash register in a shop. Unfortunately, wages, insurance, bonuses, rewards have not been following those shifts. It is indeed strange we call this a global pandemic, as it is spreading across borders and touching the majority of the world. And from our TV and phone screens, we think all over the world, everyone is experiencing the same thing. But the body experience, the personal experience, my personal potential exposure is very different if we intersect this with other factors like wealth, race, gender, government response, and culture. So indeed, it is a very personalized phenomenon. Each person suffering made particular to them, whether mentally, physically, or emotionally. In fact, many argued that we ultimately rediscovered through the pandemic is what we rediscover is the body, as fragile space itself that can be healthy or sick. Nevertheless, interesting, as a globalized phenomenon, it has brought a new form of collective thinking. For once, the entire world is synchronized, forcibly, on the same crisis. It would be great if you could decide for the future to do the same on other fundamental issues like environmental or racial justice. Second thought, new typologies around new rituals. The pandemic has indelibly marked the way we live, as entire population and the industries have drastically adjusted their usual movement and daily patterns. Millions have moved indoors, and the 24/7 digital connection for those who have access to internet and the intermixing of programs that we were promised to be upheld by the cities have coalesced in the domestic interior. Our home is no longer just our home. We have experienced a collective loss of the ritual that shaped the everyday, and to assume they will return as they once before may be naive. New programs, new typologies, and new rituals will be necessary. Not new utopias maybe, or dystopias cynically created around this emergency, but thoughtful, focused, and inclusive thinking. Unfortunately, for now, what we see is the emergence of many ideas that are informed in their new rituals to obey to the new credo, which is a mix of hygiene, well-being, and healthism. Many voiced their preoccupation that similar implication will bring us back to a modernist obsession of a sanitized body, and therefore the related uniform, sanitized, and discrete architecture will be deemed as necessary. Some refer to the risk of a long life of a Korean architecture that rejects the open plan in favor of cellular option. In this respect, Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben has been extremely skeptical of what he calls biosecurity, decision taken by government in response to COVID in the presumed interest of health or safety, but where often inequality is put in place. He states, quote, "The legislative decree immediately approved by government for hygiene and public safety reason actually produced an authentic militarization of the municipalities. The epidemic is clearly showing that the state of exception has become an authentically normal condition. Men have become so used to living in condition of permanent crisis and emergency that they don't seem to notice that their life has been reduced to a purely biological condition, one that has lost not only any social and political dimension, but even any compassion and emotional one. A society that lives in a permanent state of emergency cannot be a free one. We effectively live in a society that has sacrificed freedom to so-called security reason, and as a consequence has condemned itself to living in a permanent state of fear and insecurity. It's not surprising that we talk about the virus in terms of war. What should concern us is not so much the present, but the next," end of quote. To accommodate new health regime, distancing, washing, some proposals consider how the home and public space will naturally change to accommodate these new needs and rituals. Water basins, sinks might become more present and find a new placement in the home to these new daily rituals. Also, the way we dress, we might return to a clear distinction between city clothing and home gowns and slippers. Essentially, the act of moving between enclosed space will be marked with these small rituals between spaces, where this notion of dissolving the delineation between spaces could be abandoned in favor of spaces that clearly demarcate their physical thresholds, but with the potential of space devoid of a specific program. But beside future projection, many of the proposals focus on rethinking the use and space of the exchange that, again, to the current lockdowns could gain a new use. Corridors, staircases, balconies, and are and will all need to be rethought. These generic spaces have the capability to quickly adapt to sudden changes. Together with other space like parking lots, shopping malls, airports, now completely empty, their purpose might be rethought. For all these spaces, a larger flexibility is what is desired, in opposition to what the virus is imposing on us, a restrictive set of rules. Furthermore, many alert us all on how these changes should find a balance between a collective welfare versus an individual survival. Third thought, as the city failed us. Some ideas point to a long history that connects cities with disease. For many reasons, density, pollution, scarcity of green areas and their unequal distribution, food deserts, has made the city too often to be considered a sick place. But also the city could offer ideas and solutions to many of these issues. The spread of cholera, for example, created a political will to improve the hygiene and condition of the poor with major urban infrastructure work in the 19th century, creating the modern sewage system and bettering access to clean water. Indeed, it has been demonstrated historically that crises have been effectively used to ultimately improve policies, legal standards, and have shaped our modern city. The 21st century city could be seen as a series of calls and responses to a litany of crises that have continued to shape the built environment. But not every time these responses had the result that they intended. Government policies, for example, redlining, were used as a device intended to maintain and deepen a racial segregation within the city under the cover of financial security and instability of investment. Legacy of these policies decisions still inform our present moment, one being the growing heat gap between impoverished communities and wealthy communities, often delineated by neighborhoods that were redlined. So the city as a tool can cut two ways, to mend the inequity that is captured spatially or to further deepen its disparity. Indeed, the power of urbanism is again at play. The current lack of accessible public space has led many proposals of how to reclaim parts of our built environment. Ideas around slow streets, car-free zone that will privilege those biking or walking, as public transit is viewed as a risky space. Those cities which have jumped on these ideas immediately are changing how citizens are relating to their cities' use and its public spaces. Somehow it has forced a rediscovery of the local, and even in a more granular level of the elements which make up a neighborhood, the little idiosyncrasies that tie some time to a space, certain species of plants or animals, a window detail, the width of the street. Perhaps this forced by a new relationship will renew the ask for more public space, as our relationship and desire to accessing public space is being decoupled from the act of purchasing, especially as places of commerce have been temporarily closed. With the majority of inhabitants sheltering at home, the emptiness of the city has shown the fragility of this interdependent system. We have witnessed how the issue of homelessness have been made much more apparent, especially with some cities granting temporary permission for tent city to emerge, in part because homeless shelters have reduced capacity to the new spacing requirements. At the same time, the emptiness of the city has allowed new temporary solutions to be put in place for the emergency, such as empty hotels to house the homeless. This could maybe be a long-term strategy to be considering contributing to the question of affordable housing or in general for those experiencing housing insecurity. At the same time, the informal use by this population or others, like the domestic labor in Hong Kong to meet in elevated passage in the city on Sundays, has now been denied due to health reasons. Again, what will mean for this population if this restriction will be maintained for convenience in the future? Again, the question of permanency surfaces, entangled with feelings of hope or fear, if these changes will help or mend or worsen a fractured urban fabric. This thought of the city is very present in the proposal. Reclaiming the public space as a space for protest, for collective gathering, for collective voicing of concern has been put into question with new social distancing restriction. Recent protests have been seen spaces become more controlled, more militarized, more hostile. In the long term, this is a real concern. Some have argued that the crisis revealed the need to return to a more robust social welfare state, arguing for a radically progressive and redistributed tax code that will support a more inclusive system to provide more service for the people. But at the same time, with us, the human retreating indoors, the city is becoming a place for other species to take over. Nature, animals, and birds. Especially at the night, the city becomes a territory of other creatures. The sheer reduction in number of cars has made it easier and safer for animals to cross into neighboring ecosystem. The overall rate of roadkill has dramatically decreased. An Atlantic article framed the forced shelter at home protocol could be one of the largest conservation acts of our lifetime. But also the sudden reduction of carbon emission from passing tourism and travel has given the earth time and space to breathe. And if not the city, the focus is then on the rural and the countryside. Many ideas refer to the complexity of the relationship between city and countryside and the disparity of these territories in the crisis. The countryside become even more the place to hide and isolate yourself if you can, but mostly the territory that supports urban life. The food production could not stop. Therefore, again, laborers in this field, often undocumented and people of color, couldn't choose to not put their body at risk. As much as population who has to rely on public transportation to commute from home to work. Again, mapping these movements revealed the inequality of the system. Those who could not work from home show a larger rate of infection in their neighborhood. And also the complexity of this issue again, pushing for public transportation against individual car, for example, as advocating for a cleaner environment, has exposed more to the virus the one who have no other choice. A new measurement. A new measurement that specializes and organizes our life. An invisible grid, 6 foot by 6 foot, is now controlling our environment. We got to know it all too well this year. The grid is actually a tool of defense, a kind of imaginary defense, even if often traced on the floor for us as a reminder, but also as a way to learn how to move our bodies. Unfortunately, the normal experience of crossing a body on a sidewalk has now become a risky game. We perceive the other body as a potential vessel of illness, a danger, some even holding their breath or turning their heads to the side to respect the sanctity of this space. Healthing is imposing itself onto everything. How we occupy interiors and outside spaces is now regulated by this new grid, with plexiglass dividers and vinyl stickers making visible in this new measurement. It is not clear yet what of this new grid we will keep, even just mentally or as an habit, especially when we will be all vaccinated. But I wonder if these new standards will remain in fear of other new potential disease and current ailments. A touchless society, this is what we are living in this moment. We never thought one sense would be so dramatically cancelled by our daily experience of the city and society at large. Furthermore, it's interesting to note how the metaphor and the design strategy of the bubble, we witnessed the return of many of the images of the 60s and 70s with design of bubbles at different scales, has radically shifted meaning though. If in the counterculture it was a symbol of adaptation, feedback, democracy, empowerment, liberation from traditional architecture, now it is literally become the tool for separating and managing isolated bodies in space. The bubble may clear the separation between us and them. What is happening in these ideas also says a lot about the current concerns and way to tackle them that pervade the current cultural landscape. Only a few pointed to a possible cynical use of the pandemic as a way to accrue more wealth and worsen a growing state of inequality. Unfortunately, we've already seen scary scenarios coming up in relation to work, for example. Facebook, which has more than 48,000 employees working in 70 offices worldwide, is the largest company yet to move aggressively into remote work in the wake of the pandemic. Collectively, the embrace of remote work appends decades of conventional wisdom in Silicon Valley, where the largest company have been built on the idea of collaboration in close physical proximity. Until recently, Facebook paid a new employee a bonus up to $15,000 if they agreed to live within 10 miles of the office. Now, many of them will be able to work wherever they like, although Facebook, as already declared, will reduce the pay of workers who move to less expensive areas. So we will start to see a kind of new territorialization of distribution of labor and exploitation of areas where the cost of living is lower. At the same time, many people will not want to go back to office for a full work week after they have experienced a relative sense of autonomy and comfort in working from home. What will it mean to work together in the future? How will the culture of institution be built? And what about education? A huge investment has been placed into updating education institutions in digital infrastructure. The economic convenience of this digital outreach and engagement might be kept for the future as a way to have a true globalized education system. Again, what will be the consequence of learning just through webinar? And if more and more classes are online, what happens to urban typology of campus, lecture hall, the classroom? Finally, it is the duration of the pandemic period that should worry us. The psychological trauma will live on a certain generation, especially the youth and the elderly, the most segregated today, but also the long-term effects that many bodies are experiencing many months after having contracted the virus. That is not only the only thing to be avoided, but a chronic tiredness caused by the disease itself and our isolation from it. Somehow, this difficult time during lockdown and self-isolation is a critical review what disciplines like architecture, urbanism, and design have done or have not done to build a healthy environment. Similar to a traditional stress test, extended from a design object to the urban realm. Those who do have access to housing are grappling with the deficiency found in their living condition. The delineation between the private and the public realm has been increasingly blurred to the 24/7 digital connection and the constant mix of programs related to work, leisure, and living, all being collapsing in one place, burdening the domestic realm with much of life everyday responsibilities. For a large swath of people, their spatial realities are insufficient in accommodating the offloading of programming and its required space, promised by the upheld by the city. Open space, greenery, a place to work, exercise. This crisis shows us clearly how housing is necessary, but even more how the complexity and the richness of the city can be wielded as a tool to both include and exclude. The pandemic has brought to light a fuller picture of the elements affecting our built environment. Thank you. Maybe I was too short.
That was great. That was, yeah, wonderful. Let's all give a round of applause virtually. Hello, everyone. My name is Irene Chang. I'm the co-director of the History Theory Experiments along with James Graham. Giovanna, thank you so much for that lecture. I have to say that was an extremely impressive feat to survey and synthesize over 200 kind of discrete posts. So that was kind of incredible to watch you sort of synthesize those under these 5 themes. And really, I was kind of sitting here thinking about this kind of oscillation between hope and pessimism, which seemed to be a kind of recurring theme also this morning, sort of threading through many of these specific issues around things like justice, the boundaries between public and private space, the reshaping of domesticity, et cetera, et cetera. I was really struck by how you compared this current crisis to previous moments that seem to be these kind of emergency moments or inflection moments. You cited at the beginning of your talk 1973, which of course the CCA exhibition, Sorry Out of Gas, I think was looking at this moment of the oil crisis, the 2008 financial crisis, as these sort of moments when we saw architects galvanized to, on one hand, look for solutions to the energy crisis. And then on the other hand, as you put it, after 2008, sort of extending our sphere out to look at sort of other concerns. So I'm wondering, like, having looked at those two earlier moments, what's kind of comparable between then and this current crisis? Because crisis moments seem like potential moments for things to radically change and practices to change, disciplines to change, ways of working to change. But then, if I think about the gas crisis, so a lot of experiments with sort of energy efficiency, sustainability, solar architecture, came out of that moment. And yet, in terms of the overall arc, we're still in this kind of moment of climate crisis, and it seems like the overall pattern didn't change. So I guess I'm wondering, extrapolating from those earlier moments of crisis, like, what do you have a kind of prediction or prognosis for what will come out of this current moment?
Thanks, Irene. It's really a prediction, because somehow on the past crisis is easier because we actually can historicize that moment and we can see but I would say, also connecting to your question, also this idea of hope and pessimism, is that somehow I think one of the first things will be to, I would say, stick to the plan in the way of like not accept a kind of return to before. If in the discipline or in architects, you will see these changes bringing a kind of better solution for city or everything, is to not accept that the market, or I don't know, city planners, or we will just suggest to kind of accept to a return, because this will be easier to and reassuring for also for the population. I think what I as a prediction that I will take my risk in doing that, is that also for what I remember noticing after the 2008 crisis was also not only a kind of expansion of the field for architects, but also was the emergence of practices that are more kind of collective working. Like we've seen also in that period, like this kind of star architecture, they not anymore the kind of main drive, and have much more kind of collaborative practices coming along. And I think this will certainly be even enhanced more with this, in terms also of maybe more in a kind of multidisciplinary. I think because yeah, this is, in that sense, is a globalized experience. Architects are now in dialogue with other discipline, and this kind of combination of physical health, mental health, and so on, is start to become much more present, I think, in the concern of architects. So I guess this will change the modality of approaching, at least this is my hope, of approaching a project where all these other concerns will be as present, like the question of health, that doesn't have to be understood as a kind of modern idea of like how you will then define architecture, but somehow those questions will be present in the generation that will design right after this. And then the other things, I think, is the yeah, so on one side is this collective thinking, on the other side, I think the all the other crises that, as I said, are happening around, so that are maybe generator connected, so question of spatial injustice, racial inequality, like all these things, I think will be very much present in the next thinking.
Thanks for that. It occurs to me that I forgot to remind our audience members that they should all feel free to put their questions into the Q&A, and I'll try my best to keep an eye there and moderate questions from the audience, and also welcome any questions from the panelists. It strikes me as you were speaking just how prescient so many of the exhibitions and research initiatives at the CCA have been. I think you were sort of alluding a little bit to some of the research done for imperfect health, which I think I've directed several of my thesis students to look at this semester, because of course this is a big theme and topic, and that's kind of one of the best, I think, collections of thinking about a kind of postmodern, not postmodern, but shifting away from a kind of modernist approach to health and hygiene. So I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about that, and what some of the, I don't want to say lessons, but based on that research, what ideas do you think, are sort of informing how you're thinking about this current health crisis and pandemic, and architecture's kind of potential response to it?
I think when we did imperfect health, the hypothesis, the idea that we really wanted to put forward was that architecture should have a role that maybe was, in that sense, not the modernist one, to have the intentionality of cure his inhabitants, or provide all the natural elements that will actually create a kind of well-being for the body and the mind, but have the intentionality of care. And I think that was this distinction between cure and care, and I think it's still very relevant in this moment, in not thinking architecture as a kind of medicine. And I think in that show was very clear the response to crises like obesity, or with all the kind of idea of design that architecture should become this kind of place where invite or force you to move your body and somehow and then be part of a kind of exercise and become a performing part of your dose of physical medicine you will take every day to lose weight or so on. So the idea that architecture should not respond in a kind of direct way, I think is still for me an interesting point of sort of like understanding what are the issues, and maybe not pretend to actually give a direct answer, but think about a kind of long-term, a much longer term solution to the issues. The things we also looked at, and I think it was another interesting point, is that if there is such a direct answer, is always an answer to one problem and one population. So the risk is also to then segregate the other population. So you have seen now, for example, the crisis of this elderly facilities, where this idea of segregate a population in one typology with one possibility of living as actually condemned in there, and we saw this in jail, in all this kind of like, so this idea of segregation as a kind of typology of architecture that tends to that, we see what are the risk embodied in that, and so on. So that to me are still some of the idea that there were in that book about health, that at this point is 10 years old, that are actually a kind of long-term learning about the relationship between health and architecture somehow.
Mm. I'm curious, because you bring up this question of sort of short-term responses versus absorbing the kind of deeper meanings, lessons, sort of really understanding the kind of historical, socio-political context, cultural sort of context of an issue. So that was sort of the diagnosis, if you will, with imperfect health. With the kind of pandemic crisis, there's also been a kind of, let's say, dichotomy in the response of architects between the kind of immediate term, right? Architects printing PPE equipment, for example, in the early days, in the spring, versus wrestling with some of the structural and systemic issues that the pandemic has kind of revealed. So I'm curious if you would say something similar about the current crisis. On the other hand, in other words, that we should be focusing on the kind of longer term, deeper meanings and implications. On the other hand, there are those who say that, architects of a certain, critical persuasion that this is what they always do, is sort of try to understand the deeper context to the point where we never take action, we never intervene. So this kind of push-pull. So I'm wondering whether you would have the kind of same opinion about the current health crisis, or whether, at a certain moment, it's time to kind of jump in and try to do something along the lines of maybe what architects were doing in 1973 or after 1973. I was also struck by, I think, something that you said at the very beginning in relation to those earlier crises. I think you said something like, imagining new futures has always been easier than realizing them. And so I was kind of wondering if you could say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think when I worked on the, on the all the environmental ideas that came consequence of the oil crisis, and there was really a necessity, I will say, similar to what is now, like it seems there was no other, oil will not come back or will cost too much. So everybody was really forced in. So somehow we can say it's similar to now. We need to figure out other ways of teaching, other ways of living, so I think in that sense, this kind of forcing all of us in thinking and deep thinking, because we are forced in that. But the effort is then in really trying to build that world beyond the thinking it. And I have to say the incredible things of all the architects who put a lot of energy in the 70s was really also to change themselves, also the way they're living, and committing to these new agendas, in really rethinking the way they will live. So a passive solar house that maybe was not really working very well and freezing inside, whatever, but they really tried it until like, so the issue is like, you can think about these things, but there is still a difference in just thinking and then really committing to realize it. And I think that is the test for this one in the long term, is like, if all these ideas we are putting together, if there are good ones and we should stick to them, it's like, which is the kind of process that architects or thinkers or urbanists or designers are able to put in place to actually make this sticking somehow. So that's and I don't know which are the processes, if not to already start now to testing it somehow, as the people who actually started to test on themselves this kind of solar promises somehow. So yeah, that I will say that was my hope somehow. Yeah.
I want to give a chance to any of my fellow panelists to ask a question. Padma.
Yeah, can I just jump in? Thank you for a wonderful lecture and talk. And I just want to follow up on what Irene said. Amazing that you were able to synthesize so much information from so many different posts. And so I guess my question is about that, about the way that we look at kind of multiplicity and unity. and this moment of trying to move between kind of specific examples versus kind of universal examples, or the experience of like a specific city, a specific country, a specific household versus all households in all countries in the world. So I guess I wondered if you could just talk more generally about that, or perhaps drawing from some of the submissions you read, if you found any ways that design and architecture was able to navigate the two, the kind of universal and the specific.
Yeah, I think it's a very good point because, as I said, we have this idea that this is a similar condition that touch upon everyone, but there were a few posts and I didn't really refer to them. They were actually looking at specific cultures. Like I remember something on Morocco or on in Asia and India, of like how certain things has changed or shifted also because of kind of particular culture situation. And so maybe a move that maybe will not be, I don't know, so radical in Canada, maybe there is much more radical. So I think it will be important to not, to actually not generalize. I think what we don't want of all of this is, again, even a more kind of globalized architecture where the same solution will be just cut and paste everywhere. And I think this will be important that architects will understand what actually are the specific needs and the specific needs of the different culture and find ways of relate this concern, but and maybe new typologies or new rituals, but also being sensitive to what are the different cultures. We see in Asia actually how many of the countries have been able to manage this much better, because actually there is already a culture of hygiene that is very different, and using a mask is actually very normal, even in a non-pandemic time. So yeah, I think it will be important to recognize and acknowledge these distances and not apply a kind of one solution to a very diversified world somehow.
Can I jump in here? Because it's interesting when you mention some of the Asian countries that have been seen to manage COVID more effectively. Let me see if I can tie this together. I think you said something early in the talk about the idea of the entire world being synchronized on the same crisis, and how you know, that leads to a kind of speculation about in the future whether the world could perhaps coordinate to tackle environmental crisis or a racial justice crisis. I think that's a really intriguing thought, and definitely something that crossed my head. And I think, you know, people were speculating on early in the pandemic when there was this kind of wave of lockdowns. But if anything now, and you know, you were alluding to this just now, there's been a kind of wide variety of responses by different nation states, different localities, with different degrees of success. And you know, if you were to ask me now, I would say, you know, the US response gives me no confidence for any kind of coordinated, you know, ability to tackle climate change. If I were to pick one country, maybe it would be like China to you know, tackle large scale measures to address climate change and sustainability. But I'm not sure that, you know, pointing to like an authoritarian capitalist nation is like the best example. So I guess I'm wondering if you can, if you would stick by the idea that COVID can be a you know, predecessor for thinking about how we might tackle these larger issues around racial justice and sustainability. And it also, there's a question in the chat. I was kind of trying to bridge over to this question of climate change that Colin Murdoch asked about. I'm
reading quickly. Yeah, I I don't know, I found that this idea of synchronicity an amazing potential. And I think maybe certain institutions had tried to actually bring us to this synchronicity around climate change, or around like signing agreements where we all well, unfortunately you probably got out as the United States from this, but let's say that we sign agreements that we all stick around the plan, but I think the incredible thing is now that this is not only a series of an institution where few representatives are actually taking this decision, and this actually is an incredible moment where everyone, if it's not experiencing himself or his family or particularly his nation, still is affected by this disease. So we see, for example, Africa, that, I remember at the beginning, everybody was like, oh my God, what will happen there with the kind of, maybe there is not a structure of health that will support this. And we see that they are not maybe so affected, but they are certainly affected by not traveling, by the cut of traveling of merchandise, or by the import export and so on. So I think, to me, the potential that the world will sort of like at one point still all together gather around an issue will be an interesting thing that I don't know. I don't know if it can happen if not forced. That's the limit of my thoughts in hoping for this synchronicity, because we have seen the attempt to actually to talk about certain things all the world at the same time. I think that already, for example, if I think all the things that happen from the death of George Floyd and so on, this is something that clearly is very present in North America, is already less discussed in Europe, and I don't know in Asian country what. So already something that like this that is so crucial in this moment for us is very difficult to gather the world attention, or the world focus on this issue of inequality and justice and racial disparity somehow. So I think it will be my hope that there will be other moments that and I don't know if we will unfortunately need the crisis to gather this synchronicity, but it will be interesting if and maybe as part of the COVID, the anyhow environmental issue that has come along, because everybody is noticing the effect on the in non-polluting, etc. So maybe that is something that we will be able to tackle as part of this crisis.
Just to piggyback on that, I'm just curious, and this is building on some of the conversation in my breakout room earlier today, which was focused on questions of power, just about scales of governance. I think we've seen, especially with the pandemic response in the States, so many different scales that, the pandemic has been addressed. And then, in lieu of Irene's comments on China, we see a much more centralized form of governance. And as you have pointed out on one hand in your open letter, the collective actions from grassroots that are very inspiring and promising on one hand, but then we also see the kind of large scale global issues that we will need to tackle. How you reconcile those questions around governance and power for these types of issues that we'll see.
This is is a crucial thing, Niraj, and it's very complex question of this issue. I quoted Agamben, who, has been also very much criticized for his position, but he has been, extremely concerned by, for example, what has been put in place in Italy, where specifically he said, that even the most important institution, like the church, for example, being very present in Italy, has even accepted that people will die alone with no support, where in the past, part of the credo will also be that that institution will support in any kind of condition so somehow the fact that this kind of power in thinking that to protect life has to negate the majority of component of life and has taken over a lot of our decision, let's say, maybe less in the States, but in many countries has been like this. On the other side, we see this, this kind of bottom up, this kind of kinship, this idea of like collective support, the idea of also improvising a lot of things. Like a lot of people say, I will not even know who is my neighborhood, and now they find a kind of ways of supporting each other somehow. So I think this level of support, I think, and my hope is, but I'm pretty sure this will continue, because it's actually this also has created, I think, a doubt on this institution and the kind of support that this other top-down institution can provide, and where these other forms of supports are more efficient sometimes. So, but yeah, clearly this and I think this will continue now, even if we'll get to this vaccine. Is like, who will decide how it's distributed? Can I decide to not have it? How, so there are so many other questions again in between, a kind of power in top down and freedom and individual responsibilities that are often, I think that is one of the questions, is that in the crisis have been often put it aside in force of, we need to protect ourselves from the virus, the economy has to go on, and so on. So the question of power is really complicated, I find. And I don't know if in your, I was not able to follow your break room today, your session today, if more intelligent points than mine came about.
No, just like today, it felt very short, and we could keep going on and on with conversation on it. But at least in that conversation, there was questions around policy, tax, and a lot of things that haven't been embraced by the discipline as seen as radical or sexy. How those things are brought into the conversation, or how we change the terms of what we consider radical, in the discipline. Well,
I think having more architects working in policy making will be amazing, because I think they will be able to work the policy already with an intention of a certain output. So I think will be an interesting, opportunity.
Thank you.
You mentioned, I think you just alluded to the kind of citation from Agamben, and there's a question in the Q&A sort of related to these questions about freedom and the state of emergency. So this comes from an anonymous attendee. It says, thank you, Giovanna. I'm thinking about the quote you offered earlier. I hope I'm recalling it correctly, about the failure to notice that our lives have been reduced to a purely biological state, and that a society that lives in a constant state of emergency cannot be a free one. Is it not a masculine position that presupposes a nature-culture separation and the supremacy of the cognitive over the biological, and thus effective? And does it not simplify the situatedness of freedom? What is it and for whom? And define it as a state that's solely dependent on the will of governments. And then there's a postscript. This is Tatiana, but I'm posting anonymously because it's an option I have only seen on your Zoom calls, and I like it, and I want to encourage all others to use it. So perhaps you can decode that last part, but yeah, I mean, as you chew on that, I think it's about this. I'm curious how you interpret the question, but it seems to be questioning this idea of the kind of limitations on freedom. I mean, here in the United States, we've been trapped in this idea of, you know, mask mandates being limitations on freedom. So we have a certain kind of discourse around state power and individual freedom that we're really, you know, is exacerbating the crisis, which I think is different than the kind of condition that maybe Agamben is slightly different than the kind of condition that Agamben is talking about. So I guess, you know, I'm wondering sort of what you make of this.
Well, I think just to respond to the anonymous Tatiana, I think that Agamben really questioned the fact that the decision of the government, and obviously he really refers to the Italian that was one of the first ones to put the lockdown already in March and April. We are back in the situation. And so this idea that through the fact that you can call a kind of nation emergency, and therefore you can limit all the activities of a person to reduce to considering that, you know, the only things to protect is the biological life of the person, so that to be alive somehow. And so it tries to decode that, and it means like what means to be alive is when all the other emotional and all the other or cognitive part of our being has been kind of removed. And so that is his position, and I don't know if it is masculine or but somehow presuppose the adherence of population to a kind of government decision that decide this in respect to other who might take the decision, for example, as it is here in Canada, to suggest behavior and basically enlist what are the risks and so on, but is not enforce it with any kind of further power. Like somehow there are things that we are not supposed to do, but at the same time we are not policed. In Italy, there were drones were going around, and so you were controlled on your physical moves. So I think the whole issue also of Agamben, in his latest book, is really about also the fact that because the virus is transmitted by a person you have a relationship with, it means that your intimate become your enemy. And somehow that's idea of fear, that you start to fear from actually the people who surround you, the one you love, and so on, and you cannot touch them anymore, and so on, is isolate you from everything. So yeah, put it at this extreme, you can agree with him. At the same time, I don't know what other choices and certain governments would have had in terms of yeah, limiting the spread and so on. So I think is about the balance between a kind of individual freedom and the collective risk. And that's has been where all the government had played. We have seen Sweden, how they dealt differently. So is in deciding between those two, limiting the individual and to the risk of not defeating completely a kind of collective idea of a society. Yeah. I'm not sure I responded to Tatiana.
Well, it strikes me as you're talking that about the Canadians who sort of comply with these health recommendations, but without the kind of power of law as threat, that there is a kind of intermediate position between, you know, legal mandated lockdowns, which then, at least in the United States, invites a kind of hard response against, you know, the kind of limitations and impositions on freedom, which is that in certain societies, that kind of ethos that you were mentioning about an ethos of kind of collective support and kinship and care, the idea that we would engage in these precautions like mask wearing out of a sense of care for our neighbors and our communities, like that's a kind of, you know, in between position, that it's not imposed from without by the state, but something that is built in as an ethic, you know, in a community. That would be the ideal, but you know, of course, that has not proven to be the case, or that's not the kind of conversation that we're in, at least here in the United States. Wanted to pick up on another question. This comes from Natasha Aurora. This is maybe an easier one. Ciao, Giovanna. What's written on the marigold sign behind you? Does it serve as a reminder for something optimistic and or hopeful?
So this is actually a piece of Douglas Copeland. As you know, he has done a wonderful series that are actually dedicated to the 20th century. And he did a series for the CCA when we did a show about environmental, a kind of country history of Canada through a kind of environmental lens. And so I can maybe show you. Oops. Well, so you see, just about everything tastes like chicken these days. So I don't know, it's not so optimistic, Natasha, unfortunately. And yeah, it's about kind of food production and the fact that everything seems to yeah, feel the same. And again, in this kind of commercialized or globalized or kind of cheap food production somehow. So
I think we have time for one or two more questions.
I appreciate that. I quite love the experience of panning up the visual. Came across quite nicely. I wanted to ask you a bit more about ritual, because I really especially was taken by that in your talk. And perhaps it connects to this idea that one doesn't police behavior, but sort of engages in its practice. And so as you were talking about ritual, I thought that maybe that concept both hinges on the way that you described the burdening of domestic life. And I myself am wearing slippers right now, and so I feel that presence. But perhaps the other side of that hinge is that the idea that ritual also connects to that kind of presence or possible expansion of a public infrastructure. So I'm kind of curious, thinking about this idea that ritual could be perhaps both personal and domestic, as well as systemic or more urban or global in that sense. And so maybe my question would be that I'm very curious to hear your thoughts about what rituals we have seized upon in different crises, for example, or what kinds of rituals you see as kind of poignant at this moment.
I really like the this question of rituals. So thanks a lot, Jeanette. And the project I'm currently working, it really tries to tie the idea of new rituals with the emergence of new typologies, or actually the need of new typology of new spaces because of new needs or new rituals that we are establishing. So and I think maybe it's not a new idea somehow if you think about the work also Super Studio of like, around ceremonies, for example, and about like the idea of connecting architecture to a kind of ritual or a ceremony it was already present, for example, in their discourse. But I thought, like really at the beginning when we were asked to wash our hands so many times, and then I thought how dirty we were before, like that we were not doing it so often, So I thought like, and so there was a post, I think was really a post about the fact that this kind of maybe the home will change. So maybe now you enter and there is a place where you put the shoes, and then in the future there will be a sink, because that will be something that we will now be used to. So actually will be really not at ease to enter in a public space where actually we cannot wash our hands. So I wonder how these things will kind of deepen in our, and will require, will demands a kind of new infrastructure or a kind of new space. Will be this, we also have become extremely patient. Like now you go into an elevator and you can only go in 2 persons, so you have to wait. So it's also affecting this idea of time. So it's now, there will be then spaces where we wait. So the waiting rooms will become even more present somehow, because this idea of like that things will need to, I think it will be interesting for architects to really think through this and maybe there's not even a need to keep these spaces, because maybe it's not required really, but somehow is maybe a new idea of comfort, and maybe an idea of collective comfort, because this is an experience you're all sharing, will come out of this. So maybe the quest of a different comfort and a different sharing of these rituals, I think might emerge. Yeah. So
I think that's such a beautiful question and also response in it. I was very struck in your talk how you called attention to the kinds of behaviors, responses that are sort of stored at the level of the body. And, as we talk about sort of what changes will the pandemic bring about in terms of policy or in terms of architectural practice, there's, sort of potentially larger scale changes, but there are also kind of just changes at the level of our own, sort of intimate bodily kind of responses. You were talking about the 6x6 grid, and what of that remains a certain, it's like how nowadays when we watch television shows or movies from before the pandemic and we see people kissing or, close to each other, we're like, whoa, that seems very unsafe. But, we've been sort of reprogrammed. Our sense of distance and intimacy is transformed. And so those are kind of changes that are hard to get at, but maybe persistent. And I loved how in your talk you called attention to those things that are sort of below the surface that are changing, that have changed over the last 7-8 months.
Yeah. If you think that I think is only one moment in our life that we are constantly said, do not touch. Like there, I don't know, between 4 and 8, I don't know, years old, you are constantly reminded to not touch anything. And that's the kind of moment, but then we never have this, culturally, maybe people are less prone to touch other bodies, but somehow this is, so this, I agree with you, Irene, is a kind of mental organization of like this kind of proximity. It's like, I wonder if we really beside that, we will need to re-educate ourselves to kind of cancel this 6x6 grid. I think if things will be redesigned in such a way that that will become the kind of new, that we will kind of keep that distance. Yeah, that that's part I really don't know how, beside our body learning, is like how we will, if everything will be considered safer, if we will actually keep a certain distance, also to avoid even flu, you know. So yeah, I think I don't know how it's been in the States, but in Europe has been a kind of traumatizing, seeing that the school desk has been transformed in one monospace. And that has been a radical change, because we actually never had that. You always had a friend you will share a desk with. And that's to be then to become a unity, I think is also, it's not just a spatial organization, it's also an idea of society that you grow up with. I wonder, like, one of my hope will be that architects will resist some of these in the future, to sort of like seeing the kind of connection between, design and and power in that sense, and the power of the design in determining, well, if you grow up always having your desk as a single kid, then you are growing in a very individualized society. So what are the consequences of this? This, we have seen it in the home, like the moment that we have decided that each kid has to have his own room, that has determined obviously a more, even inside the family nucleus, the idea that each one has his own space. So these changes that are happening unnoticed at some time, on the long term, they have really impact on society. So I hope that architects will actually consider and maybe resist pointing to these consequences.
That's actually a perfect note, in a way, to end us and the discussion on. Thank you, Giovanna, for bringing us back to both the responsibility and also the challenge, of where we might sort of pick up again, post-pandemic as architects, and what we might need to resist really as part of our own sort of job. So it's my distinct pleasure to issue a huge thank you, Giovanna, for the brilliant summary of the many, many themes that have emerged through this work. And thank you to Irene for moderating the different strands and topics of conversation tonight. And thank you also to Keith and Padma for making this event possible through the wonderful partnership between our CCA and now the other CCA and the Asian Art Museum, specifically the After Hope project. And thank you, of course, also to Sarah, who did brilliant work behind the scene, to keep this running smoothly. So thanks for everyone attending. Thanks for the great questions, and have a wonderful rest of your week.
Thanks again for having me, and for putting together this amazing project. It has been a pleasure to really look at it carefully. Thanks again for the invitation, and for all the very smart questions. Thanks a lot.